The first one that I'm extremely happy that is here is Ellie Gomes Callus from Bloomberg NEF. So please, Ellie, join me on stage. Ellie is a metal and mining analyst at Bloomberg NEF. Her research covers battery metal markets, global critical mineral policies, and pathway to decarbonation for the mining sector. And her presentation is called The Race to Secure Critical Minerals.
Thank you. Just a disclaimer today, I'm a chemist, so thank you, Francesco, for inviting me to gatecrash this geology event. Oh, these aren't my slides. Perfect. Great. So I'm sure I don't have to convince you the importance of geology and understanding the critical minerals potentials in different regions. But what I'm here to talk about today is the bigger picture, and specifically in terms of policy. So we're going to look at the European Union's approach and the USA's approach to trying to build a secure and reliable critical minerals supply chain. But first, I just wanted to give an introduction into BNEF, Bloomberg NEF. We are a strategic research house. I cover metals and mining, but we cover a range of energy transition sectors, so from solar, wind, to hydrogen and sustainable finance as well. What's unique about what we do is that we have a global coverage. So I'm based in London, but we have over 300 analysts across 18 locations that give an insight on a global scale. So, into critical minerals. So the road to net zero is going to see the growth of low carbon power and transport solutions, as well as the growth of our global grid networks. And unsurprisingly, the demand for the energy transition metals needed to fuel this growth will grow over the same period. So at the bottom here, we can see demand for these energy transition metals in 2022 and a demand in 2050 under BNEF's economic transition scenario, which is our base case, which looks at how the energy sector is going to evolve based on economics, but also under our net zero scenario, which is our scenario which looks at one route to net zero. And under this scenario, the demand for energy transition metals is set to reach a massive 250 million tons by 2050. And to put this strategic opportunity into financial opportunity, we can see that last year in 2022, the energy transitions metal sector was worth $0.1 trillion. Under our base case scenario, it reaches $6 trillion in 2050. But if we reach net zero, we see a market value of up to $10 trillion in terms of critical minerals. So there's this strategic and financial opportunity. But what is the biggest problem faced by the sector today? So I'm going to demonstrate this problem using these three maps. And it shows how critical mineral supply chains get more concentrated as we go from reserves to refineries, using battery metals, so lithium, cobalt, nickel, as an example. So here we see the reserves, and we see there's a relatively even distribution across the globe. But as soon as we move to mines and mine supply, we see this global activity shrink. And then going to refined supply, we see this concentration reach even higher, and of course, particularly towards Asia, and in particular, China. So China's strong presence across all stages of the critical minerals supply chain has meant that they're a supply chain leader in the space. And this is thanks to policies introduced by the Chinese government back in the early 2000s, where they saw this opportunity and they seized it before anyone else did. However, with China's success has come this exacerbated risk in the critical mineral supply chain, because when you're concentrated, as I'm sure some of you know, when you're concentrated in only one or few markets, that supply chain risk is massively increased. So taking that into consideration, we've seen lots of other regions trying to build their own secure and supply critical mineral supply chain using policy as a foundation. And we're going to look at two examples pushed forward by their demand centers for critical minerals. We're going to look at the US and the European Union. And in particular, the US Inflation Reduction Act, which was introduced in August 2022, and the European Commission's proposal for the Critical Raw Materials Act, which was introduced earlier this year. And in the meantime, BNF have introduced this framework which considers 4 topics that are needed for a perfect critical minerals policy. And these include the expansion of domestic supply, the acceleration of new projects, diversification of supply, and the sustainability of extraction. So let's compare these policies using this framework as a guideline, starting with expansion. So policies that urge action often take a carrot or stick approach. Carrot obtaining to reward, and stick to regulation and expectations that are given by governments for industry to meet. And in terms of expanding domestic supply, we've seen the US take the reward approach, and we've seen the EU take the regulatory approach. And more specifically, in the US, they've introduced this production tax credit where suppliers that produce critical minerals within the US can get up to 10% of their total production costs back in credit. And in the EU, we've seen them take this targeted approach where there's clear guidelines for where they want industry to go. And usually there's a bit of a debate about what's more effective, carrot or stick. But in this case, BNF sees the fact that the targets from the EU are not legally binding, and we find this significantly decreases the impact of the stick approach in this case. Mining is also a really capital-intensive industry, and it's also important to consider funding in this case. With the IRA and the tax credits, they've introduced these uncapped amounts of money, and it also aligns really nicely with the bipartisan infrastructure law. And in this law, there's specific pots of money for critical minerals. And funding in the US is pretty easy to navigate, sector-specific, and focus on implementation. But how much new money was introduced in the Critical Raw Materials Act? I'm sure some of you know the answer to this already, but no new money was introduced in this act. But that's not to say that the EU doesn't provide money for energy transition. BNF have calculated there's over 1 trillion euros of funding available for energy transition projects within the EU, which of course is a lot of money. But what is difficult is that it's quite hard to navigate for projects, and it can be very competitive. And even within energy transition sectors, we're seeing critical minerals compete with solar or other industries, which makes it difficult. And it makes it difficult to see the tangible impact of this funding in practice. Going to acceleration now. So in mining, long permitting timelines are one of the biggest bottlenecks of critical minerals production. At the top here, we can see this environmental impact assessment, and this is just one of the many timely and long processes in place before mining projects can get under development. And if you consider the whole approval process, in the US, it can take up to 10 years to receive all the permits that are needed, and in the EU, up to 7 years in some cases. And recognizing this, both the US and the EU have taken a step forward in trying to address this. So in the US, they're updating their 150-year-old mining act. And that's, I don't have to explain, but obviously very long overdue. And in the EU, we've seen them return to the targeted approach. So they want permits for extraction to take no longer than 2 years, and for refining to take no longer than 12 months. And in both of these cases, this is a step in the right direction. But of course, changing legislation as well as streamlining permitting processes across 27 member states is no easy feat and will take time to implement. Moving to diversification, we've seen the US focus a lot on collaboration with their free trade markets, and they've had a particular critical minerals partnership with Japan. And we've seen the EU have this approach too, with specific strategic partnerships with critical minerals nations. And yes, this is good, and this is going to help them diversify, but more partnerships will be needed. And not just on a governmental level, but also on a company level. So what BNEF sees is a focus on emerging resource-rich regions, as well as emerging mining juniors, could help the EU and the US replicate this sort of first mover approach that has been so useful within China. And something that can help both these regions identify that is, of course, the geological data that is available, because this is fundamental to recognizing the potential. So greater alignment between geological departments across the world is vital for helping private sector in particular and governments in recognizing where these relationships could take place. And finally, we move to sustainability. So in 800 pages of the US Inflation Reduction Act and its related critical minerals guidance, we saw that the words sustainable and sustainability were mentioned 0 times. In the Critical Raw Materials Act, which was around an eighth of a length, we saw it mentioned 75 times. And the EU has always been a trailblazer for sustainable practices, and these two numbers highlight that in this space, the EU continues to have this leading position within critical minerals, and the US has a long way to catch up in that sense. So finally, we've looked at these policies across this framework, but what we've seen is there is no such thing as perfection. Both policies have their strengths, their weaknesses, and their own priorities. You could argue that the US has come out all guns blazing, because we've seen over £1 billion of investment in the US since the Inflation Reduction Act was announced, and this is just in raw materials. But the CRMA isn't fully legislated yet, and we can't make a direct comparison right now. But what could be really powerful for the European Union is that unique strategy of tackling security and sustainability simultaneously, and we do anticipate this to give them an edge in the long run. But actually, in terms of building a secure and reliable critical minerals supply chain, it's not US versus the EU. And I think we need to sort of remove this race idea and realize it's part of a bigger picture. And in fact, similar to how we've seen the world tackle an issue like climate change and net zero with the Paris Agreement, building a secure and critical minerals supply chain requires collaboration between the US, the EU, and the rest of the world to reach a shared goal. So, yeah, hopefully that's helpful and is a good start to provide a bigger picture into what we see coming next.